Democracy is a process. It's the best process we have available for the purposes of ensuring that power is not used in order to subjugate and in order to create a kind of society in which effectively nobody really wants to live in, including the powerful. So democracy is a very imperfect system of government. It's never set in stone. It's constantly in flux, constantly work in progress. It needs to be contested again and again. And in the end, it's a very fragile flower that it's very, very easy to trample upon. We have labored long and hard to ensure that we preach democracy outside, but we practice it at home, because democracy begins at home. We are struggling, and it is a struggle, to maintain what we call a combination of horizontality and verticality. So horizontality means that anyone, can just join DIEM, as long as you espouse our manifesto and our principles, and start an organization. We call it a spontaneous collective at DSC, DIEM Spontaneous Collective, in your region, amongst people with similar interests, and just take it away. Just indulge in activism, in activities, in political organizing, in debates in your area amongst your colleagues that promote our common principles without the permission of anyone, any central authority within DIEM. All these spontaneous collectives contribute to the policy framework of DIEM25, to our campaigning. At the same time, we have a degree of verticality. We have a coordinating collective, something like a central coordinating committee, for the purposes of coordinating, because you need to coordinate this big beast now that we have hundreds and hundreds and thousands of members, hundreds of organizations and tens of thousands of members. Maintaining the horizontality, verticality balance is work in progress. But as I said before, democracy is work in progress. So there's no such thing as the perfect democratic model. It's something that we constantly have to create as we move on. Given the circumstances on the ground and the effective demolition of the credibility of almost everyone, Mrs. Merkel has lost her own credibility within the CDU. The SPD has no credibility even amongst the good people that support it. The Greens are non-existent. They have been co-opted by ordoliberalism to a very, very large degree. Die Linke is split. Given the sad state of affairs, I think that a hung parliament is the best thing we can hope for. The most disastrous outcome would be the one that I think is very likely, a coalition between the Christian Democrats and the Free Democrats. And this would be a disaster because the Free Democrats are, even though they have good positions on a number of things like refugees, like borders, being liberals or neoliberals, their view of what needs to happen in Europe, in the Eurozone in particular, is absolutely catastrophic. Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble is going to have a great ally in the FDP. Stopping this coalition between the Christian Democrats and the FDP should be every progressive's goal at the moment. The European Union was constructed on purpose as a democracy-free zone. Just like OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, was constructed as a cartel. Similarly, remember the first name of the European Union was called the European Communities of Coal and Steel, just like OPEC, a cartel. It was an economic and of course a political and a cultural project, but it was a cartel. The bureaucracy in Brussels was installed there as a bureaucracy of the cartel. Its purpose was to ensure that there would be no demos playing any role in decision making. Of course, there had to be a great deal of communication, a great deal of, let's say, in old-fashioned terms, but I think very apt terms, propaganda, And that took the form of creating a democratic shell in which to embed this cartel. So you have the European Parliament, which is not really a parliament, since it cannot initiate legislation. It's the only parliament in the universe that can't initiate legislation. And in the end, all decisions are taken behind closed doors without any transparency or accountability. So when people say that there is a democratic deficit in Brussels and the European Union, I say to them, no, you're being extremely analytically imprecise. There is no democracy, zero democracy. And what we need to do is we need to confront this cartel, clash with it mercilessly in order to democratize it. But then again, let's think back to the 19th century. Capitalism was meant to exclude democracy. Even the first parliaments, the House of Commons in Britain, its purpose was to keep the demos out. And democratic movements stormed the castles, and we need to storm the Brussels castles. You will allow me to answer this question by means of a real case discussion I had with Wolfgang Schäuble. At some point in our discussions, I said to him, I mentioned the case of the privatization of 14 regional airports in Greece. A privatization that the troika of lenders and he himself were really pushing really hard on us, which in the end, after my resignation, happened. All of them were purchased in the end for a pittance by Fraport, a German, actually nationalized company, a state-owned company. And I said to Wolfgang, Wolfgang, would you ever agree that in Germany, all the important regional airports should be privatized, be sold to a single company, in other words, no competition. If you sell all of them to one company, you create a monopoly, without any shares being retained for the regional governments or for the federal government. Would you ever agree to that in Germany? He said, no, of course I wouldn't. And I said, well, why are you imposing it on us? And his answer, in not so many words, but through mostly his expression is, you can't expect the same rules to apply to Greece and to Germany. You are a debtor colony. The German government, in particular Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble, talk again and again and again about the rules and how important they are. Now, of course, this is true. They do insist that everybody else sticks to the rules. But it turns out that they themselves don't. So, for instance, agreements. When agreements are broken by Greece or by Portugal, Greece and Portugal are lambasted. But there are several important, crucial agreements made with Greece, which were violated from the other side. So, for instance, there was an agreement that the profits made by the European Central Bank on Greek government bonds should be returned to Greece. Those have not been returned to Greece. Instead, Dr. Wolfgang Schäuble pocketed a very large percentage of them and put them in his budget against the explicit agreements at the Eurogroup level. Let me give you another example of broken rules. According to the excessive deficit and surplus or imbalances procedures in the European Union, not only should you get penalized if you have an excessive budget deficit, but you should also be penalized an excessive trade surplus. Anything above 6% of GDP should immediately bring upon you a penalty. Now, Germany has violated this by the means of a trade surplus which is more than 9.5%, not 6, 9.5%. And what has happened to the rule according to which it should be penalized by the EU? It has been quietly forgotten. Now, what happens when rules are only applied to the weak? You end up with an autocracy like we had in the 19th century. It used to be called something like gunboat diplomacy. This is what we have today. I forbid myself from entering the guessing game. Our job as activists, as citizens, as politicians, as members of DIEM25 is not to predict, but it is to act. We have a moral responsibility to ourselves. We have a very finite life, at least that's what I think. We might as well have fun trying to change this world, not to adapt ourselves to it. And part of it means no pessimism, no optimism, but great hope in the capacity of humanity to wrestle control over its destiny from forces that are both idiotic and authoritarian.